Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode of Amateur Traveler is sponsored by DK Eyewitness Travel Guides, which are my guidebook of choice. You can learn more about DK Travel Guides at dk.com.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 444. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about waterfalls and gorges, rock art, and crocodiles as we go to Northern Australia. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm very pleased to have DK Eyewitness Travel Guides as a sponsor for Amateur Traveler. I approached DK because, as I mentioned before on the show, the Eyewitness Travel Guides are one of my favorite guidebook series. The guides are filled with gorgeous pictures, which I love, have great historic and cultural information, and also include great visual guides and have maps to museums, walking tours, and neighborhoods. I mentioned on a recent episode we did on Paris that I loved the walk along the Canal Saint-Martin, and I learned about that walk from the DK Eyewitness Travel Guide to Paris. I just checked my bookshelf and it looks like over the years I've bought 19 different guides from the series. Learn more about DK Eyewitness Travel Guides at dk.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Sam Guerra from escapefromthebay.blogspot.com, who's come to talk to us about Northern Australia. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's something I've always wanted to do.
And Sam, you understand you've been listening to the show for more than a few days.
Yes, been listening almost on a weekly basis since 2007.
Excellent.
Part of the reason that inspired me to travel in the first place, to be honest.
Oh, excellent. Well, I always like to hear that. And I say we're talking about Northern Australia, but you actually recommend we talk about Northern Australia, and we leave the center, which is Ayers Rock and Alice Springs, for instance, for another show.
Indeed. It's quite far away. It took some 20 hours driving, at least.
And you did drive the distance between the two.
Yep. We did a lot of driving. Did over 17,000 kilometers in total.
Oh, my. Okay. And Northern Australia, why should someone go to what I understand they call the top half?
The top end.
The top end, okay.
Yep, it's one of the more exotic parts of Australia for sure, and it's definitely the closest place you'll be able to go to get an authentic feel for like aboriginal culture, which in my opinion is something that makes Australia unique. There's a lot of natural beauty and a lot of wildlife up there. It's nearly untouched in a way.
And you say it's exotic. Having been to, say, Sydney, which is not generally described as exotic, just cool. What makes Darwin, for instance, which is the center of that area, different?
Well, Darwin per se is just a little city. There's hardly much to it at all. I mean, it's just a few blocks. Really, what makes the top end shine is when you get out of the city and when you go to the national parks around the area.
Got it.
It might not be exactly what you imagine when you go to Australia because there's a lot of water. It's very lush, but at the same time, it still has that sense of the outback.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're in the tropics at that point.
Yeah, yeah. It would be like tropical savanna is what the landscape would be.
Okay. Well, and what kind of itinerary would you recommend for somebody who has, say, a week to 2 weeks to explore this part of Australia?
You probably would want to lean a bit more towards 2 weeks if you were going to bother to take the trip at all, because depending on where you're flying from, jet lag.
I think my son slept through the first 2 weeks of our trip to Australia. Or the first 2 weeks, two days, sorry. That wasn't that bad.
Yeah. Well, on top of that, then you have the 24-hour flight from almost anywhere. As far as itinerary is concerned, I would say I would probably stop in Darwin just to kind of, because you're going to be flying into there anyhow.
Sure.
And if you don't rent a car, which is what I would highly recommend, then that's going to be your base. But get out of Darwin as quickly as possible, generally, I would say. There's a few cool things to do there. There's the Litchfield National Park, Kakadu National Park, and Nitmiluk National Park, which is kind of like they make a pretty convenient circle around the top end.
And when you say circle, you mentioned how many miles you have driven so far. So how big a circle are you talking about?
This is not so bad, but you're still going to be looking at between, I think Darwin to Litchfield is an hour and a half maybe, and Darwin to Kakadu is some 2.5 hours. So the whole loop would probably at least take you wouldn't want to do it in one day, obviously, but if you were going to just drive it straight, it would probably take 6 or 7 hours to drive around the circle. Okay, and then why would we go to each one and what would we see? All right, so Darwin, it's a surprisingly cosmopolitan city for how tiny it is. Mm-hmm. Apparently it's got a booming economy right now with some of the natural gas projects that they're opening up there, but the only things that I might recommend in Darwin would be the Mindle Beach sunset markets, which are on Thursdays and Sundays. And those are pretty touristy, but it's a pretty good thing if you want to go try some local bush tucker, as they call it. If you want to try to eat the emu or the crocodile or kangaroo. And you say bush tucker, you mean bush food? Yeah. Okay. The native bush foods. I can translate. My cousin who is Australian lived with us for 2 years. So I tried a crocodile sandwich there. It was kind of like chicken, like they say, but yeah, it's much more not as tender. It's more rubbery. So I wouldn't necessarily prefer it over chicken. Right. There's quite a bit of military history and kind of historic buildings around the Esplanade Loop along the Darwin waterfront area. If you're into World War II history, there's not that much to find there, but they do have some tours, and mainly the World War II history sites are around the Darwin Harbor. Mm-hmm. Which was bombed by the Japanese in World War II, as I recall. I mean, they got that close, basically. Yep, it's simply the Australian Pearl Harbor. Uh-huh. Other than that, I would say there's not much to see in Darwin. I would highly recommend renting a car. You also might want to rent a four-wheel drive if you have any intention of getting to the cooler places, or if you're uncomfortable driving on dirt roads for long distances, because that's inevitably what you're going to have to do. The first place you could go, let's say, is Litchfield. Okay. As I mentioned, it's like maybe an hour and a half drive, depending on where you want to go in the park from Darwin, and it's a pretty amazing park. It's probably the underrated compared to Kakadu, which is what everyone else seems to always rave about. But Litchfield is much more laid back, and there's not as many tourists. It's kind of, there are tourists, but you can go at your own pace a bit.
And all of these national parks we're going there for the flora and the fauna.
Yeah, and the waterfalls. I
And the
have to say.
waterfalls. Okay, all right.
Yeah. And Litchfield National Park's a perfect example. If you just want to like kind of camp out and relax, the waterfalls there are pretty amazing. They have two of the bigger ones are Florence Falls, which I spent basically a whole day at. Nature makes the best swimming pools, I tell you. It's just a good place to relax is all. You have the giant waterfalls, and they're pretty much running you around. If you speaking of which, if you intend on getting the most out of it, I'd say you'd have to travel between late June and August.
Okay. So we're traveling there in their winter.
Yes, but don't let that fool you. It's still very, very hot. When we were there, it was early June, and it was still pretty much averaging like 30 degrees every day.
In Celsius, obviously.
Which is great for me. I love the heat. My girlfriend didn't necessarily like it that much.
Right. And humid, I would assume, because of all of the water there.
Yeah.
Because we're in the tropics.
Well, it's supposed to be the dry season, so it's not as humid as it would otherwise be in, say, October when it's supposed to be unbearable.
And then with that, for those who don't think in Celsius, we're still in the high 80s. So
Yeah.
Okay.
And it pretty much doesn't change day to night. It's pretty consistent.
Okay.
Yeah, the two waterfalls I'd recommend checking out in Litchfield is definitely Florence Falls, which is kind of hard to get down to if you want. I mean, there's a stairway, but it's a very steep stairway that goes down to it, so it might be something to consider if you're not too mobile.
Okay.
But once you're down there, yeah, it's awesome. And then there's another one, which is the bigger and more popular one, is Wangi Falls, which is further along the highway. That area, you can do a lot of hiking up and around the waterfalls, and you can go swimming as well. There's lots of flying foxes in the forest around there. It's pretty interesting, and tons of creepy crawlies as well.
And when you say flying foxes, I know exactly what you're talking about because we saw them in Sydney at the botanical gardens there, and they really creeped out my wife and my daughter. So we're talking about really large bats.
Yeah, like the size of a fox.
Right.
I found them pretty fascinating. I love watching them. They're very loud, so you're going to hear them long before you see them. You'd think that they'd be sleeping during the day, but they seem pretty rambunctious. Just to mention, in case people are squeamish as well, like they're said to be sometimes freshwater crocodiles in the Wangi Falls, not in the Florence Falls, but the Wangi Falls, which is the more popular of the one. But the freshwater crocodiles, apparently, you don't have to worry about.
Okay.
They're not man-eating. Stay away from them, and they will not bother you. They're not going to be in the center of the pool anyhow. They're going to be off on the side.
Well, I heard an interesting stat. I don't know if we've talked about it on the show yet, but I heard this a few months back. People who go to Australia, they've red-billed bisons in a sunburned country and all the things that can kill you in Australia. And they've heard about the sharks and the saltwater crocodiles and the 7 of the top 10 venomous snakes and the box jellyfish and the tunnel web spiders and all of those things. And I was surprised to learn that the thing that kills the animal that kills more people than all of those combined is
the king toad.
No, is the bumblebee. From allergic reactions. I mean, basically, they do have some deaths from saltwater crocodiles and box jellyfish. It's about 1 a year for most of those, except for the venomous snakes, and they haven't lost anybody to venomous snakes in 20 years or something like that. I mean, really rather a long time since they invented anti-venom. So it's just not quite as dangerous as they told us about in some of the books and the Crocodile Hunter and some of those things.
Yeah,
unless, of course, you're allergic to bumblebees, in which case, you know.
Speaking of bumblebees, funny story. We were camping, not in Litchfield, but in one of the other national parks, and we had our windows down as we would have to in such heat. And we had a hornet fly into our window it was the largest flying insect I have ever seen in my life.
This is the flying fox version of the hornet family.
Yes, it was probably as big as the palm of my hand, and it sounded like a helicopter when it came in, and I had to tell my girlfriend in a very particular way so that she wouldn't panic that we had to get out of the car.
Yeah, well, you figure if the bats are larger, then the insects probably are larger, that there's probably a reason for that.
Everything is larger. If you don't like creepy crawlies, then like you said, it is a bit overstated. They're not everywhere, but this region of Australia is the home to them. Like,
Sure, yeah.
if you're going to find them, this is where you're going to find them. And we saw more than our fair share of large spiders and bugs and they have an infestation of cane toads in some places as well, which is an invasive species here.
Right.
Actually, they kill the snakes because the snakes try to eat them and they're venomous. They even kill crocodiles when crocodiles try to eat them.
Oh, wow. Interesting. So
Yes.
when we're eating the wild animals at the market, you're suggesting stay away from the cane toad. Okay.
Yeah, no one's going to try to sell you
Good
that.
to know
They
that.
hate them here. One more place I'd recommend checking out just for a quick stop in Litchfield is the termite mounds.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
excellent.
they have massive termite mounds that can be 15 feet high.
Okay. I was picturing 6 feet high and thought that was pretty big. So
Nope. They can be 15 feet tall, and you will no doubt see them if you're going down the highway.
Huh.
They're built apparently to perfectly regulate the temperature, so they're kind of like Phillips screwdriver.
Okay.
So that all of the thin ends are facing towards the directions that the sun is moving, so that the sun never hits them directly or on a flat surface. And there's just so many of them. Apparently, prior to the introduction of livestock into the Northern Territory, the termites actually served the same function. So they would clear the grass and the debris, and they will prune the landscape, prune the environment.
Interesting.
And there's so many of them. I'm not sure exactly how many termites each one would hold, but there's millions of them probably, because you see them all along the highway as well. And people along the highway, if you're driving, you'll notice people put shirts over them so that they look like people, and they'll put bonnets on the top and everything. I don't know why they do this, but never was able to figure out or get an answer to that. But so, kind of the main attraction in the top end is Kakadu National Park,
which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site too.
Yes, and it's massive. It's you won't be able to see hardly any of it. I mean, the mountain that's accessible by road is such a small percentage. The first stop there, and this is probably one of the best highlights for us, was the Mary River Wetlands. We took a tour. There's plenty of providers to go cruising on the Mary River Wetlands. The region's pretty set up for tourism for the most part.
And we'd find them before we leave Darwin, or we'd find them after we went to the national park?
Preferably before you leave Darwin, because the phone coverage, even if you have a phone you can use in Australia, is pretty spotty once you get out of the city.
And by the way, I did look up the size of the national park, and it is 19,804 square kilometers, or 7,646 square miles. So large.
Very. The Mary River Wetlands cruise, the day before we did it, actually, a man was fishing on the Mary River Wetlands, not on a tour, but on his own, a fisherman, a local, and he was taken by a crocodile, and it was all over the newspapers, as often are crocodile-related things in the Northern Territory.
Well, and the good news is that it's notable that it doesn't happen every day.
Yeah, indeed. If you are into wildlife photography, that is the place to go, because they take you out onto the Billabong.
And Billabong would be a watering hole.
Yeah, it's like a wetland or a swamp, I suppose.
I just remember that once a jolly swag man camped by a Billabong, so...
Yeah, if you're into wildlife photography, that's definitely the place to go.
Okay.
Because there's just an endless amount of bird life. That's where you're going to see the crocodiles as well, if that's indeed what you want to see. We did manage to see a few of the females, which aren't usually as large as the males, but we went pretty early in the season, so a lot of the basically the later you go into the dry season, the more chances are that you're going to see larger crocodiles, because the watering holes, they dry up.
Okay.
So this will be the only source of water for them to live in.
Got it.
But yeah, we did manage to see a few 6-foot crocodiles or so. They brought us fairly close to them. We're not uncomfortably close, but...
Well, and as I recall from going to a zoo up in Queensland in Australia, the crocodile hunts by ambush. And so if it can see you and you can see it, you're relatively safe because
Yep.
it knows that you would be watching for it. So it's swimming in those muddy creeks is where people usually get hurt.
Yep. The tour guide actually told us his friend had been down there, not on the Billabong or the Billabong itself, but in another little kind of puddle, I suppose, photographing the birds. And when he developed his pictures, he actually saw that there was a crocodile in the puddle. He saw the little eyes poking up. And he was probably closer than he should have been, given that he told us, for every one you see, there's 12 you don't.
Huh.
But not to scare you, it's definitely worth doing. I mean, just they have the lotus flowers.
Sure.
Were in bloom when we were there, and that was just incredible. You can actually take 3 different tours. You can either take like an hour and a half, or like 2.5 hours with dinner or something like that. And we took the short one because we're backpackers on a budget, but it would have been nice to really get to relax and see everything. But yeah, I would recommend as well you take a camera with a pretty good zoom because they don't necessarily get you that close.
Excellent.
I mean, a lot of it's birds.
And what else did you do in the park?
Another one of the pretty amazing sites was the Aboriginal rock art sites at Ubir and Nulangi Rock. They're 2 different sites at 2 kind of different ends of the park, but I mean, I haven't seen much rock art to be fair, but I was really shocked at how well preserved it is. Basically, they have these large overhangs, and underneath them, they call them the rock art galleries. Over the last 10,000 years, the Aboriginal people have been painting on these surfaces, and then every generation will come back and paint over the previous generation's things. So you kind of see several layers going back just by looking at one wall. Some of the art is as recent as the 1960s. Very interesting artwork.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the pictures. It looks fascinating.
The main attraction in Kakadu, aside from the Ubir and Nulangi rock sites, are Jim Jim and Twin Falls, which unfortunately we could not visit, which is very disappointing because we got there quite early in the dry season, so a lot of things were still flooded and they hadn't had the time to open up the roads again.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So our only option of getting there was a very expensive tour to go to only one of the falls because the other one hadn't had the road work done yet, which we just chose to forego. But from the pictures I've seen, it's quite amazing. The landscape itself is just like epic. It goes on forever. When you go to Ubir or the Nulangi rock site, when you get up on top of the escarpment, it just reaches forever. It's just endless wetland and savanna forest land.
Excellent.
The last place in the loop would be Nitmaluk National Park.
Okay.
And Nitmaluk is mainly known for the Catherine River that flows through the park. Again, it's another good place to go just to relax.
Okay.
So the Leyland Falls is further up the river, and once you get there, again, you have a big waterfall and a big swimming hole. You can go do a lot of hiking around the area. And if you just go up to the upper pools, just that walk alone is just worth it. I mean, it's just like a rock pool playground. It's incredibly beautiful.
Now, it sounded like you were saying that we should spend more than a couple days doing this whole loop. And you had said budget more than a week to do the whole trip, but it doesn't sound like the whole loop is taking us a week in the way you're recommending we do it.
I suppose it just depends on how much you want to relax, because I would recommend at least a full day in Litchfield.
Okay.
But then Kakadu, you can easily take, I would say, 4 or more days probably just to do it, because you have, depending on how busy you want to be in one day, my travel style technically is a bit hectic. I like to see a lot and do it really quickly, because we often don't have a lot of time. So we ended up doing several things stacked up so that we were busy from the moment we got up to the moment we go to bed. But I know a lot of people who go on vacation don't really prefer to spend their time like that.
Okay.
Kakadu, yeah, like I mean, 3 to 4 days. And then Nitmaluk, I would say you could probably spend another 2 to 3 days there as well.
Okay.
The most popular thing to do in Nitmaluk National Park is to go on a boat trip up the Catherine Gorge, which is basically a big sandstone gorge that rises pretty precipitously on both sides of the river. I would actually recommend, instead of paying for the boat ride, you just rent a kayak and do it if you are fit enough to do so. The kayaking itself isn't very difficult, especially in the dry season when the river isn't flowing. Because of the way that it works, there's kind of like natural dams at various points in the river so that it just stops the movement of the water. But the kayaking looked like it would have been probably the better decision.
So it sounds like you did the riverboat cruise? Okay.
I did do the riverboat cruise, and the only reason I would suggest the kayaking is just because the riverboat makes a lot of noise when it's moving. And towards the end of the second gorge, which is probably the most beautiful part easily, they turned off the boat and just let you sit and kind of take in the ambience. And you can hear like condors shouting in the distance. And it just, the way that it echoes down the canyon, just looking at the walls and just, it kind of, the whole time you're in the top end, I would say, it just feels like you're in an ancient place. It just has this sense about it. With the kayaking as well, you can stop and swim, and there's plenty of places to do so at your own leisure, which when you do the boat isn't exactly the case. But if you weren't going to kayak, I'd still recommend doing the boat trip. It's definitely worth it. Anything else we should see here before we head back to Darwin? There are things that we didn't go to, but if we had time, we could have, such as Berry Creek. I believe they have hot springs. If you feel like getting into a hot spring when it's already 30 degrees outside, you can be my guest. What surprised you about Northern Australia? Well, the distances. Sure. It feels like how maybe Australia would have been 40 years ago. Okay. There's relatively little civilization as far as that's concerned. You can easily drive for hours and hours and hours and not see a place to eat. I mean, they have gas stations and such. Well, I know Australia is not very densely populated anyway, and I was just seeing that Northern Australia has half the total area of Australia and a quarter of the population. So it's even less densely populated. Yeah, I mean, this kind of trip, to be fair, it takes a bit of planning. Unless you're going to go on a tour, if you're going to do it by yourself, you should probably kind of work out the distances, work out what you're going to eat, and make sure that you get gas when you can. Don't ever assume that there will be another gas station. We pretty much used a half-tank rule, so as soon as we hit half-tank, the next gas station we saw, that's where we're getting gas, because there's plenty of signs, maybe not so much in the top end, but around Australia where you see there's no gas for the next 200 kilometers. And another actually recommendation I would give is to take plenty of cash with you, because apparently ATMs in the Northern Territory do not work. Okay. I don't know how many times I found myself in this situation where no one would take debit or credit, and every ATM I went to was out of service. Oh, wow. So, okay. I don't know if it was just the season or what the deal was, but it just could have been our luck. Another thing is, if you're looking to buy any Aboriginal artwork, preferably do it at the cultural centers, which are, like, they have one in Kakadu National Park, because there it's typically non-for-profit or less expensive than you would buy in, say, a gallery in Darwin, where it's primarily geared towards tourism. Okay. And obviously, you probably end up getting something a bit more authentic in that case anyhow. What do the guidebooks recommend for Northern Australia that you would say probably not worth the time? Probably, like I've mentioned, I would say just stay out of Darwin for the most part. There's not much to do there. It's not very interesting. And take the kayak instead of the boat. Okay. And then it sounded like, just because when we started talking about the top end, that you're going to recommend, if we go down to Uluru or Alice Springs, that we fly. That drive, you've done the drive. You can say you've done it, but you wouldn't necessarily say that I should do it. Exactly. There is a whole lot of nothing for a whole lot of hours. I think it was something like 25 hours to get from Darwin to Uluru driving. And obviously, when you're on a limited time frame in a vacation, that's not exactly how you want to spend your time. Well, and we should say, so as long as we're talking about Uluru or Ayers Rock, there's some controversy about whether you should visit it, whether you should go up into the rock, because it is sacred ground for the Aborigines, is my understanding. Right. So what did you decide? Well, to be honest, I didn't have a choice at the time because the high winds prevented anyone. They closed it down. But Personally, I would have not gone up because you can just kind of see when you go look at where the people usually go up the chain that's running up the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Just from the foot traffic that goes up there. I mean, it's sandstone, so it rubs away fairly easily. There is a pretty deep indentation going up the rock of where people are walking. So if you keep climbing the rock, there will be no more rock eventually.
Might take a little time.
Yeah, just a little while. But I was actually surprised, if we're speaking of Uluru, that apparently in the wet season, there are waterfalls coming down on all sides of the rock.
Mm-hmm. No, I remember seeing pictures of that.
I was not expecting that, to be honest. I was not there during the wet season, but there were still some trickles of waterfalls coming down from the top, and you could definitely see all of where the water had worn away holes in the rock.
And besides making sure you keep the car filled up, any other warnings you would give?
Watch where you're walking, things like that, because there are spiders and snakes about. They're generally not going to bother you, but just don't antagonize them.
Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about that people should know about is you've been in New Zealand and Australia for more than just a few weeks because you're taking advantage of an interesting legal opportunity in both the two countries. You want to tell us more about the visa that you're on?
Yeah, it's called a working holiday visa. American youth, I should say, between the ages of 18 and 30 can travel in Australia or New Zealand for up to 12 months. And it gives you all the rights to work and everything so that you can just make money to keep the travels moving. It's not a very difficult thing to obtain, and I don't even think there's a limit on the number that you can get, that we can get per year. So, I mean, me and my girlfriend applied for New Zealand and Australia and probably had our answer within less than a week. And it was just a short questionnaire, basically making sure that we weren't convicted felons of any kind and that we didn't have children.
No, we certainly wouldn't want convicted felons in Australia, which they can get sensitive about. So the language, any times that you have been standing there speaking the same language as somebody in Australia and yet had no idea what they were talking about?
I would say no, but I had the unfair advantage of having lived in New Zealand for a year before coming to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So their lingo is pretty similar. When I first arrived in New Zealand, I would definitely say it took me a moment to kind of adjust. But once I was in Australia, it's not so different from the New Zealanders to where I even could tell the difference, other than they say no worries and mate.
They really do. While that is a stereotype, and what I love it is they don't just say it, it really is an attitude.
Indeed.
Before we get to my last three questions, anything else we should know before we head off to Northern Australia?
Bring bug repellent and sunscreen.
Well, sunscreen, sure. The hole in the ozone there.
Yeah. The bug repellent is absolute necessity, though, because the mosquitoes are absolutely ravenous.
Last three questions. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Northern Australia.
It's just when you're driving along the highway and not only are you seeing termite mounds dressed in bonnets and shirts, but they've also altered some of the signs in creative ways, like the kangaroo sign. I remember I passed one of the signs and someone had pretty convincingly turned the black silhouette of a kangaroo into a dinosaur. And it looked pretty authentic.
Finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Northern Australia when what?
When you are surrounded by natural beauty and aboriginal culture, and the temperature never dips beneath 31 degrees Celsius.
And if you had to summarize Northern Australia in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Ancient, exotic, and untamed.
Our guest again has been Sam Guerra. And Sam, where can people read more about your travels?
escapefromthebay.blogspot.com.
And the bay that you're escaping from is?
The San Francisco Bay area.
We made some reference to that, but we didn't say it. Excellent. Sam, thanks for coming on The Amateur Traveler, and thanks so much for listening for the last, 7 years or something like that as well.
My pleasure.
In news of the community, I heard from Jamie, and Jamie had recommended an episode on Baltimore, and in response to that episode, said, I usually make a weekend breakfast/brunch for the whole family while listening to your latest show. I did quite a dance when I heard you had already moved forward with the Baltimore podcast. Nancy Perot did such a great job. I really enjoyed the show and look forward to sharing. My husband and I are DC junkies, so people often ask us what to do while visiting there. I will definitely include this episode in future suggestions. Hope you get a chance to kick back in Baltimore one weekend in the future trip out east. What Nancy said about people being super accepting is true. It is as diverse as it is laid back and accepting. If you go in the summer, there is always a festival going on in some neighborhood we found. They just close off the streets, allow drinks on the streets, and everyone is welcome. Thanks again for this episode specifically, but for all of them too. Best wishes from sunny Southwest and the Albuquerque Balloon Festival, Jamie. And Jamie, I'm glad you enjoyed it. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. Remember to check out our sponsor, DK Eyewitness Travel Guides at dk.com. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also check out the links for everything we talked about in the show notes and in the lyrics of this episode. And in a few weeks, a transcript of this episode will go up thanks to J-Way Travel from jwaytravel.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Chris2X, and as always, thanks so much for listening.